So our last panel of the day is a really exciting one where we're going to focus on foundational academic discipline and science education. Dr. Bernard Harris is the CEO of the National Math and Science Initiative. He was also the first African American to complete a spacewalk as a veteran astronaut and has logged more, this is ridiculous, he's logged more than 438 hours. And like, who's counting, but he's traveled 7.2 million miles in space. So that's a big number. Dr. Margaret Honey is the president and CEO of the New York Hall of Science, a museum founded during the 1964-65 World's Fair. That sounds really cool, and I need to visit. You saw her earlier in this segment, produced by this event sponsor, The Collaborative, but I wanted her here to have my own discussion with her. And finally, Dr. Stephen Pruitt is the president of the Southern Regional Education Board, which works with states to improve education at every level. He's also a former Kentucky State Commissioner for Education. In the interest of transparency, the Southern Regional Education Board also acts as one of the many expert reviewers for the sponsor of today's event, which I look as a great thing. Well, let me just ask you, I'm going to start with Dr. Pruitt before we get to 7.2 million miles in a great museum. But I am interested, part of our talk today is there are a lot of little boutique stories around in the country. There are great teachers out in the country. There are innovative things that are going on that I see left and right. I just got back from South by Southwest in Austin, and I saw lots of cool things. I'm interested in what we've learned so that you can create a playbook of best and promising practices in education, particularly recovering from this era of COVID and the impact. And so I'm interested in how you rationalize the information and feedback. So, Dr. Pruitt, Stephen, what are some of the elements of that are really key to this conversation we have today?
Well, I'd say that one of the first things to think about is the fact that you have to think about all of this stuff in totality. There's not the opportunity for us to think about pieces of things. Now, we can take pieces of things and build them up, but as science people, we know that anytime you affect one part of a system, it affects another part of the system. So having things that actually think more than, say, for instance, just buying laptops for people to have one-to-one. Well, you got to think bigger than that. You got to think about how are we going to sustain this over time. I think, unfortunately, one of the things in education that we tend to do is look for silver bullets. Silver bullets only work for werewolves. You actually have to think about this more deeply, and you have to think about how are we going to make sure that we sustain this over time. So when we're looking at the promising practices that are going on in the South, what we're looking for is not the one shot. Not just a remediation that would help somebody pass a test, but actually what would help that person become the better version of themselves as a learner that would sustain them over time.
Well, thank you for that. And Dr. Harris, I'm kind of blown away by the 7.2 million miles. Did you feel every mile, or did they just rush by? But more seriously, look, I think one of the questions I was asked earlier is what is the state of, what is the health, the state, the anchorage, if you will, of science education in this country today? Are we doing it right? Are we doing it in a wobbly way? What is your perspective?
Well, I think that we're doing it, right? And we're doing it individually based on the communities that are being addressed. I think in general, there are STEM deserts around the country that we need to address. And that's something that we're trying to do at the National Math and Science Initiative, is to raise the level of high quality STEM education and insert that into our traditional educational systems, whether they're in the cities or in the rural areas, to make sure that our young people are going to be competitive. I think Dr. Pruitt kind of mentioned earlier that we have to look at this thing as a whole. And being a guy that has seen the world from a different perspective, we're no longer competing as a country. We're competing with the rest of the world. And so we have to make sure that our students are prepared for that new way of doing business.
Well, before I jump to Dr. Honey, let me just ask you a question. And maybe this is my own pet peeve, but I did a series of events around the nation at one point with a large manufacturing operation. And we went to Ohio, went to Pennsylvania, went to Massachusetts, went to different parts. I interviewed the governors in each of these states, and we looked at the partnerships with local community colleges and things we were trying to do to sort of revive STEM education, kind of look at engineering, even look at manufacturing, around which a lot of these pieces were part of the ecosystem. But I heard over and over and over again that there was stigma related to those students that were thinking they might become engineers because so many lost their jobs in sort of the great hollowing out. We as a nation are talking about reshoring a lot of things, bringing a lot of manufacturing back, looking at high tech. And I'm wondering, this is a discussion I haven't seen anybody have, is this an opportunity to go back to these families that felt cheated, if you will, in terms of opportunity, where their families were, and then try to say, hey, we ought to have a national campaign. We ought to kind of go out and remind people that this is a strength, not a weakness. I don't know if that makes sense, but I have to tell you, it was palpable in these former manufacturing communities that I was in around the country, and their disappointment, 2 decades ago, that pathway ended up being a dead end.
Well, I think things have changed now. We're in the 21st century where technology is driving everything that we do in engineering, and particularly education and STEM is going to be critical to that equation. So, I used this the other day as an example, being a space guy, looking at what's happening on the commercial side in terms of new private industry being involved in this. And the question was, why are folks interested in going into space and orbiting platforms? And then said, well, that's because that's the future. So when we think about jobs, they're not going to be just manufacturing jobs. By the way, the manufacturing jobs that are required these days require expertise in math and science. They're technical jobs. They're not the manual jobs of the old. And so that's happening here on Earth, but in space, we're going to have a whole new industry that gets developed in low Earth orbit and beyond. And some of our kids are not only going to get up in the morning and go to a job here on Earth, but they're going to go up and maybe get on a shuttle and go up to an orbiting platform. That is the future that we need to be prepared for.
Dr. Honey, I have not been to the New York Hall of Science, and I hope you're going to invite me because I get up to New York a lot and I sound fascinated. But I did recently interview Lonnie Bunch. Lonnie is the 13th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and he said, look, we have a job both to kind of create things that are aspirational, that help broaden the horizons of people. We also have to reflect who we are as a nation. Our people have to see themselves in our institutions. How are you accomplishing that in the New York Hall of Science? What's that lift that you're trying to create as particularly young people encounter science through what you do?
Yeah. One of the great things about running a science center or science museum is that we have degrees of freedom to be creative and exploratory in ways that I think can be really challenging in a school environment. And what that looks like in our environment is that science is highly experiential. It's hands-on. We design experiences so that young people are given opportunities to ask questions, to use, and also to use the tools of science for exploration and discovery. And I think one of the greatest travesties, I would call it, of our current education system, particularly at the elementary level, is not only is science an afterthought, so far too many children are not even getting exposure to scientific ideas, but we teach it as a memorization exercise. We don't teach it as a domain of inquiry and problem solving and question asking and all of the skills that are essential in today's world. And that's criminal because we could, and there are, as you mentioned at the outset, there are examples all over the country of teachers and school districts doing this well. I think we need to build on and scale those examples of effective practice up and make them accessible for all children.
Yeah, I guess, before I jump back to Scott Pruitt, I just want to ask this question, which is, I'm familiar with the history. I was very young at the time it happened. I actually wasn't alive maybe when Sputnik went up, but it kind of drove basically a person's individual insecurity about being behind, at that time, the Russians, in space exploration. that we had, engineers popping up and rocket scientists in West Virginia, that we had a whole wave of science basically take over. I'm just wondering, in not a silly way, whether we need to somehow recreate that sense of tension and challenge and competition and understand it. I see it out there myself, but I don't know out in, regular American society whether there is a sense of insecurity that might drive greater commitments and investment. Is that a silly thing? And, Dr. Honey, I would just love to hear whether that's, something you think, because part of it is critical reasoning, all the problem-solving skills, thinking ahead was what we did back then. I just don't know how we get back to that today.
Well, it's not silly at all. That kind of aspiration, that vision, that realization of, stretching yourself and taking a leap and making it possible. I mean, it's still alive and well today. What we don't have is a nation united behind that vision. And, sadly, we've seen that during the pandemic that so many of our fellow citizens are skeptical of science. They don't trust it. They don't believe in it. And honestly, I think that has a lot to do with the very anemic state of science education in this country. And there's a tremendous amount of work we have to do to change that.
Bernard, I saw you jumping out of your chair on that one before I jumped to Dr. Pruitt. Did you want to say something?
Oh, certainly. I think she is exactly right. We do need a Sputnik moment. We need a national initiative, a campaign around STEM education to raise the bar of expectations of our young people. I have to remind people when the pandemic happened, who were the folks that came up with the remedies, came up with the vaccines? They were scientists. They were educated folks in STEM. And so if we are going to move forward as a nation, as a people on this earth, we've got to make sure that this type of education is for everyone, right? We talk about equity. We need to make sure that happens. But, we have communities in inner city that are not getting the education that they need, particularly the science education that they need. There are areas in the rural areas that also need that. We just started something we called an education learning accelerator in Alabama to address issues like this, where we're actually educating teachers on how to become better STEM teachers. And it's working.
Wow, that's great. Stephen Pruitt, I in every organization I've been affiliated with that failed, I realized that it was because they worried about the wrong things. And the ones that succeeded were the ones who were able to discipline themselves to worry about the right things. And I think we're discussing, one of the things of how do you get focus and attention and priority about the right things and get education off working on the wrong things. So you were, Kentucky State Commissioner of Education, you were a chemistry teacher, you're now president of this, big education board and kind of doing this stuff. I'd love to get your insights on how we systemically, it's a big ship, but how do we begin to move a system or seduce these, dissonant parts of the system and to begin prioritizing the right things, if that's the right, and you can challenge my framing, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I sort of feel like that's what we're talking about.
Well, it's hard to, it's pretty easy to oversimplify actually, because education is not rocket science, because actually rocket science may be a little easier, with all due respect, Bernard. You got all these complexities of human beings. I would say that the first thing is to recognize that we have a single system from K through the workforce. When we start thinking about these things in pieces, then we often kind of twinkle around the edges, but we don't have a full systemic view of how to shift a system. One of the biggest things is we've got to set a goal for where we want to be over the next 10, 20 years. The workforce is changing so significantly. Bernard hit on this. We're predicting in the South that if we don't do a better job of science education, STEM education, this is hit on in the National Academy's call to action, for instance, that we may see 18 million unemployable adults by 2030 because they don't have the technical skills to be involved in a workforce that is so reliant on scientific thinking. And so we've got to set a goal first of where we want to get And then from there, we have to start to evaluate what do the systems need to do to align to ensure that as students move from one place to another, that they are actually getting what they need to be successful at that next level. It's we actually have to start or stop thinking about teaching science for science sake or teaching STEM for STEM's sake. The reason is because we simply will not have people who can be involved in a workforce by 2030 based on where we're going. So basically what I'm saying is you can't work like the Jetsons if you're thinking like the Flintstones. We actually have to really reevaluate where we are now. And we have the opportunity coming out of COVID to recognize that each state and our country need to think, what do we want our workforce to look like? Now let's align all of our systems, K-12, post-secondary, workforce, so that we can actually help our country continue to be the great economic power that it is.
Well, look, we're going to take questions from the audience. I'm going to do my little editorial. I do a ton of events and programs on science. I believe it's such a priority for the nation. Today's discussion, we're talking about young people, education, COVID. I'm very glad we have. I hope all three of you will come back when I'm doing a program on science and the science infrastructure in this country. Glad it's part of this discussion, but come back and be part of these other discussions too. It might be very rewarding. But we do have an audience question from Brigitte Blom. Brigitte?
Good afternoon. My name is Bridget Blum. I'm the president and CEO of the Pruitt Committee for Academic Excellence in Kentucky. My question for the panel: deep education reform is now nearly 40 years old in our nation, and improvements have certainly been made. Yet we still lag other countries, and there's growing division between traditional standards-based reform and deeper learning. How to measure and what to measure. How do we coalesce around a way forward that results in the US's continued improvement in education by state and our standings internationally? Thank you.
Bridget, that was a perfect question. I probably should have asked an hour ago. So great. Thank you so much for it. But let me start out. Stephen Pruitt.
Well, hi, Bridget. Good to see you again, being a fellow Kentuckian there. I kind of go back to what I was saying before. I really think that part of our problem is when we think about a K-12 system, a post-secondary system, and a workforce system, just so scientifically speaking, systems compete. They compete for resources. They compete for anything that helps that system survive. I think until we start to realize that when we make changes in K-12, it affects post-secondary, until we realize that we have a workforce that is changing so drastically that we can't afford to not have that, I think we got to really, the whole idea of reform really needs to be about how does the system need to respond to a specific issue. And for me, that biggest issue is going to be the workforce and the economy. STEM is got to be widened. It's not going to be just engineers and just doctors anymore. It's going to be welders, advanced manufacturing. It's going to be even carpentry. I mean, those skills are going to be really critical. So to me, to change that means that we've got to reevaluate the whole system. That means that when we're looking at assessment, it means we've got to look at more individualized assessment. We've got to look at assessment that allows a student who loves welding to be able to show their math proficiency possibly in a more unique way than currently sitting at a table taking a test. I personally believe in state assessments, but I think that we could do a lot better job with those. But at the end of the day, it's about recognizing that if these systems don't shift, in our southern region, as I said, we can't afford to have 18 million unemployable adults based on where we're headed.
Right. Well, thank you. And Margaret, I should have asked you before, is it Dr. Honey or Dr. Honey?
It's Honey.
Honey, okay,
H-O-N-E-Y.
great. Well, Margaret Honey, Dr. Margaret Honey, love to get your thoughts on, not only what we measure, but I mean, Bridget raised this very interesting point about, remembering, as Bernard Harris just said, there's another world out there that we've got to benchmark ourselves with. They're investing. You go to India, you go to China, there are a lot of PhDs in engineering and science and math and biotech and all that stuff. So I'm just interested in how you would respond to her.
Yeah, it was a great question that Bridget asked. And I would say, I would point first and foremost to a fact, which we need to keep repeating over and over and over again, which is those countries that have invested significantly in their education system have first and foremost invested in their educators, in their teachers, in their workforce to ensure that they have high quality, well-trained and well-supported people in the classroom. They don't believe in programs that train teachers up in 6 weeks and send them into our most challenging schools. They believe in and they invest in ensuring that they are bringing the best professionals into the classrooms that they can. So that's one. Two, I think we need high quality, creative, as Stephen and Bernard were saying, student-centered materials that, enliven and enrich what learning can be for young people. It can be magical. Come to my museum. You'll see it happening every day here. It is magical, right? And the third issue, which Stephen touched on as well, is we absolutely need to change our assessment systems. They need to be more performance-based. If we have assessments that are just asking you to spit out and regurgitate facts, we are going to be guaranteed that we are going to bore kids to death in classroom settings, and they will choose to opt out. And too much of science education is taught that way now. If we could sort of get those three core ingredients right, our people, our resources, and the tools we use to evaluate student performances, we could change the game. It's not rocket science. Right, it's actually doable. And we know it's doable because there are pockets all over the country that are doing it and doing it well.
And Bernard, I'm going to give you the last word, but I'm going to add this element. In Austin, these last few days at South by Southwest, in between great movies and films we're doing and great comedy shows and great music, the other experiences were all built around space, high tech, virtual reality and augmented reality. They were science and math created and crafted environments of the future. And so when I think about a National Math and Science Initiative, I saw elements of that in this pop culture scene, and would just love, as you reflect on this question of what we should measure and how we compare, are there kind of green sprouts in this conversation at somewhere like South by Southwest and elsewhere that are going to help us along?
So when I'm talking to young people and talking to educators, and I think Dr. Honey hit on something that I'm really sensitive about, and that is that we don't give our teachers their due. They are the future. They hold in their hand the best investment that this country can make, and that is our young people. So we do need to support them. We need to also connect the dots. And so I've been to South by Southwest, and I can't think of a better platform. There are others that are out there that actually highlight technology and where we're headed to actually connect the dots for our students. Well, that's good for you and I to go to South by Southwest, but how does that word get down to the students that need to hear that message? Right. So we need to work on that too, which I think is important. Because if we don't do that, they don't see how science and STEM is relevant to what they're doing. Now, I always have to remind them that the technology that they love working on, these devices that we have, was done by a knowledgeable person in STEM. And if they are looking for the best paying jobs will be in STEM, despite anything else that we say. And so that's important. It's already been said by Dr. Pruitt and Dr. Honey that this needs to be an integrated solution, starting at pre-K all the way up through college. We have something we call vertical teaming, and that is the teachers in elementary school need to know what the teachers are going to teach in middle school and high school and beyond, so that we end up connecting the dots, And that is, wasn't expecting that to happen.
We've been trying to reach you concerning your car's extended warranty.
Oh my God.
You should have received something in the mail about your car's
All right,
extended
so much for that.
warranty.
So
Since you
anyhow,
haven't gotten a response, we are giving you a
it is so
final
important
call
for us
before we
to
close out your file.
get these messages
Press
out.
1 to speak with someone about
Well, thank you for that. Well, listen, I want to thank Dr. Bernard Harris, who is not only CEO of the National Math and Science Initiative, but I just computed it out, if I'm right, that the 7.2 million miles he's gone in 438 hours in space means he went 16,438 miles an hour on average. So you can play around with me if I'm right or wrong about that, but that's pretty good. And I want to thank Dr. Margaret Honey, President and CEO of the New York Hall of Science. I hope you'll let me visit. And Dr. Stephen Pruitt, President of the Southern Regional Education Board. Thank you so much for joining us today. Great conversation, and I look forward to having more.
Thank you for having us.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. What a great set of conversations. A very big thank you to the Collaborative for Student Success for their support. Really great conversations. Thanks to all of you attendees for joining us for these discussions, and for any of you who missed this. And like I said, I think this show's going to have some shelf life. I think there's some good show and tell in this. So show your friends, tweet this out, share it with folks who are interested in how we're measuring what we're doing in education today with the dollars that are coming in. How are we kind of approaching science and kind of building up some of the wobbly parts of the American educational system? We're going to have all of these videos up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.